So now that it's recording, the question really was about cost centers. What's a cost center? And so I kind of drive this as a thought process of inputs and outputs. Typically, and something that's not a cost center, i.e., something that's driving revenue or growth, it's input equals an output, i.e., higher growth, higher revenues, and so forth. IT has typically been seen as a cost center, i.e., the inputs in the form of a budget, the output is typically the status quo, right? So your computers work. Um, your email works, that kind of stuff. And so it's stuff. It's like plumbing. Like if you got rid of it, maybe it would work. Maybe it has some issues. I don't know. So as it pertains to data teams, for example, data teams can also be seen as a cost center or a growth center, right? And um, so hopefully that distinction is clear. If it's not, let me know. But I would say like nowadays, especially with the downturn, anything that's not really seen as growing revenue or reducing costs will be seen as maybe a potential line item to be reduced. So that includes data teams. So I would say if data teams can find a way to generate value, which is a term that drives me insane. I was just writing a blog post on that a second ago. But focus on being a growth center instead of just a cost sink, so to speak. Cost sinks get cut in recessions, is what happens, right? Cost sinks are barely tolerated in good times, and so that's hopefully a useful distinction to you. But it's also a topic that I can talk about for hours and come to no clear resolution on. So, but yeah. But Parkinson's law, I would say, is a real thing, and this is something you need to watch out for. It's in your careers. Is like Parkinson's law, somebody described as the work fits the time allocated to it. Much the same way, work will fit the budget allocated to it. So whether or not this work makes any sense at all, what I've seen over and over is IT teams will, spend an exorbitant amount of money just to continue having projects, continue having toys to support, and this becomes kind of a beast, not unlike the federal government in some ways. So.
Yeah, I've never about Parkinson's law. I'm going to dive more into that. That's interesting.
It's fascinating because it applies to your life. So, for example, if I gave you, Parker, 2 weeks to get something done that may take you an hour, when do you think you're going to get that done?
Probably like 48 hours, depending on who it's for.
Yeah, right. Yeah, so it's like we have a tendency to, I would say, procrastinate and fill time to the extent that it's convenient for us, and so. But work is not exempt from that, and so it's just something you got to keep in mind. 1 week, 6 days from now, is somebody commented, "Yep, exactly." So,
Hey, that's on time, right? You could even go beyond time.
Yeah.
hmm often, yeah. It's good to see everybody here. By the way, I'm Joe. I'm co-author of Fundamentals of Data Engineering. So thanks for letting me join your book club. Hope you're enjoying the book. So, but happy to answer any questions you have, data or anything. So,
I have a question.
sure.
So I haven't started on the book yet. My wife is getting it for me for Christmas, so something to look forward to. But on the last topic that we just talked about, if I were looking to join an organization in a DE capacity, what question should I ask either the recruiter or hiring manager to see if the data professionals they were treated as first-class citizens or they're always playing defense, like you said? Because generally they're not going to say anything negative about that team or their data department, right? So what can I ask them to kind of infer the situation before joining?
That's a good question. I mean, the first thing I would do is probably ask if you could just talk to the data team at some point and just kind of interview them, sort of flip the role. But assuming you can't, right? It's somebody asked they like to ask how decisions get made. I think that's a fair point. I think that's a good one. The recruiter may or may not know how that works, though. I would probably do some scuttlebutt kind of in between, like maybe look at the tenure of people on LinkedIn, for example, on this data team. Maybe Glassdoor ratings would be another thing. So, do your detective work behind the scenes, while trying to put on a polite face. But questions you can ask the recruiter. Obviously, the question of how decisions gets made, I think that's a good one. I would also ask how long the team has been around, and how many bosses they've had. You can obviously infer that from LinkedIn potentially, but there's a pretty strong correlation with longevity and maybe the team's performance and acceptance in the business. But it's like joining any team. I mean, you just have to do a lot of. I would say that a lot of your work is detective work behind the scenes. A recruiter's job isn't to like sway you away from an opportunity. I mean, they get incentivized to get you in the door for an interview. Um, so yeah, unfortunately. But once you're with the team, I would definitely ask some hard questions, right? And so what some of those questions might be, tell me about successes and failures you've had as a team, and more importantly, how were failures met, right? Did the organization accept these as learning experiences, or were you chided and beaten for these errors of your ways and things like that? Because you really want to know how the team is treated when things are good and when things are bad, right? Because that'll ultimately be you if you get that job. So I found that teams where teams are supported and mistakes are accepted, and at least you can learn from. I found that's a really good environment for data teams to flourish. I found where data teams are always on defense, and you can kind of see this when you can kind of hear this when you talk to people and teams like especially when you start hearing language like kind of us against them type of language. That's a really good indication that you have a siloed organization, and siloed organizations, especially if you're a data team, is typically a recipe for disaster because the sense of collaboration isn't there. It's very well that you might be walking into a cost center as well at that point. Cost centers typically are on defense. If it's us versus them type of behavior and the language seems very defensive, that's probably a huge red flag, and I would stay away.
Thank you.
Yep.
Also, just real quick on that us versus them thing, like that also totally occurs within a data team, where like if the whole organization is saying like, no, like it's the data team's fault, and the data team can also be like, no, it's the data engineer's fault, or it's whatever. Like I've probably seen it more internally than externally.
Yeah, that could happen for sure. And those are also red flags. I would say a really good book you should check out is this book called Team Topologies. It's a really good read. It just talks about basically optimizing organizations for technology and decision making flow and stuff. So, but there's an interesting law that sort of, I wouldn't say a corollary to Parkinson's law, but it's an equally interesting law called Conway's law, which basically says that organizations will design systems according to the way that organization communicates. And so this is very important for you to know as a data engineer, actually, because when you're designing systems, it's very possible that the systems you're designing very much mimic the way your organization is set up to communicate. And so if an organization is very siloed, I mean, guess what kind of systems you'll be working on as an engineer, right? And so, it's a fascinating law of the universe, but I've never seen it broken actually. So, but these are good questions. I like the tone of this because it's interesting that this book it's very much about data engineering as a practice, right? But this is also like the things that I think are gonna raise or sink your career as a data engineer is usually nothing to do with data engineering at all. It's all the other stuff that you got to deal with working in a company. But that's like any job. So, but good questions. And somebody asked a question in the chat here. Let me see here. Abdella asks, is the book beginner friendly? Yes, it is. I would say the first part especially is beginner friendly. As you go through the book, it does get more technical. I would say that we intentionally wrote the book in a way that was, even at its most technical, it's still accessible to people. Because that's the whole point of the book, right? If you wanted if you want to get thrown to the deep end, I would say like Designing Data Intensive Applications is a fantastic book, and it will also throw you into the deep end. We consider our book very much the prequel to that book, and they're both, I think, very complementary, but it's very, very beginner friendly. So.
And there you go.
Sorry. I was just going to say I had a question, if you don't mind. So it was actually regarding it's also sort of in this sort of train of thought where it's more about like data engineering as a practice as an employee and in a lot of companies. So I guess part of my question is in the book you make a distinction between internal and external data engineers, and you point out that those roles are often intertwined. It's not explicitly defined or so forth. But I am curious just from a perspective of one of the things that I'm fairly new to my job, and one of the things that I sometimes sort of grapple with is sort of being able to quantify the impact and especially communicate the impact of what I'm doing to certain stakeholders within my organization specifically. And it seems like, from the understanding of what I've had so far with some of the roles that I've been involved in data engineering spaces and so forth, that's not just a issue starting on, at least, that's just exclusive to me. It seems like there are other people also who just struggle sometimes being able to communicate, because as you mentioned, right, like if things are fixed, right, even if you're in a growth space, right, opposed to a cost center, there is this perception that it's a bit hard to quantify, like if the pipelines are working, right, they're working, right, and even though data can be viewed as a product in of itself, it's still kind of hard to like express that in like explicit metrics, especially when you're starting on. So, what would be your advice to be able to try to make it so that what you're doing can be more easily quantified and then be visibly expressed to the other stakeholders within your organization?
This has always been the classic problem with data. It's so funny you mentioned this. I was literally writing a blog article for my Substack
Oh,
about
really?
this. Yeah, about basically the question of adding value, right? How is value determined? It's a very subtle answer, right? And so you could take the blood instrument approach of saying all value must be ROI driven, right? And so that's what I hear a lot of people say. But then, okay, so calculate ROI and tell me what that means. And in a lot of cases, ROI is not necessarily a straightforward thing to answer, right? So there's an old saying in marketing, I think it came out in the 20s, but it's like, I spend a lot of money on my marketing and I don't know, which 50% is effective or something like that, right? And so, in back then it was more branding type marketing activities. And a question I remember a famous marketer asked is, well, what's the ROI of putting on your shoes in the morning or your socks or whatever, right? And so it's like, so there's certain things where ROI is very, I would say, fuzzy to calculate. But there's other areas where ROI is maybe very obvious to calculate. And so, if you have, again, it comes back to inputs and outputs. So if your team costs X amount of money plus infrastructure cost, that's total cost. That's the investment, and the return is, well, hopefully something greater than that number, right? But so some of the things I would ask maybe from your boss is, oh, thanks, Dave. Yeah, that's the quote. Some of the questions I would ask probably of your boss is, well, okay, so how are you measured at the end of the day, right? Just candidly asking, like, okay, so how are you and this team supposed to be measured, and what are we expected to deliver? Hopefully your boss can give you a clear answer on that. If your boss can't, then I would really be concerned at that point. Because what I've seen a lot of cases, especially in the last several years, is data teams are hired for the sake of having a data team. Whether or not they're necessary or not is a different question. And so a way that I like to actually answer this question is also invert the question and ask, okay, so if we did nothing, if we didn't have these data pipelines, if we didn't have this team and this infrastructure, what would be the impact of that, right? Would things stop working? Would the company start losing money? Would people not know what they're doing? And I suppose then you could work backwards and maybe perhaps figure out some metrics there. And so sometimes it's often the act of like inverting a question, which might give you your answer, not necessarily taking the straightforward approach of saying, I add value in this way. It's sort of like again, back to a plumbing analogy. If the pipes in your house or your apartment suddenly stopped working, I'm sure you would notice. And then that, the inconvenience and the time to fix that, I suppose, is maybe what that's worth to you. But I suppose also if the question of what happens if we don't have all these data systems in this data team, if the answer is still unclear, then I think then you also have an answer, which might not be the answer you want, but it's the answer you get. So, um, yeah, so hopefully that answers your question. But it's a
I
tricky
think that
value is
I think
just
that's
it's a weird thing. It's a weird thing to describe. So, and it's a question too that I've seen, in the decades I've been in data. It's a question that I've seen. So I wrote a Substack on this a couple weeks ago, where it was, the two questions I see popping up in data. The first one is, do I believe data? And the second is, do I get value from it if I trust it, right? And the value has always been a giant question because data is a very nebulous thing, right? With software engineering, for example, the systems work, right? So data, now I would say if data is tied to a product, for example, the answer is much more clear because you can derive an ROI off of that pretty easy. But if it's creating dashboards for people or internal machine learning models or something like what's describing value is much harder in that case. And so, but it's been the same since day one.
Makes sense. Thanks.
Yeah, yeah, good question.
I have another question. Have you seen an organization that did not have a data culture with like the same employees without doing an overhaul of new employees, change their habits, change their data system, product, whatever you want to call it, and become a solid data culture? Like the stakeholders are like leveraging whatever data is produced.
I have, yep, I've seen it happen. It's tough. I mean, the crux is convincing, like you gotta communicate what the milestones you hope you set to deliver, and then communicate as you deliver on those milestones. I think is a really big thing. Just communicate early and often, and develop a good rapport with people. That goes a long way. If you put yourself in the shoes of a stakeholder, like say I just cut your team a $30 million check to revamp some things and hopefully modernize our data stack. Like, do you think I would? Personally, I would. I'd be really weirded out and concerned if I just cut you a $30 million check and I never heard from you again. So that would be equally disturbing, and I would probably have to make some decisions quickly. So I would say where it doesn't work, and I had one client like this recently where the owner of the company was, I think, just micromanaged a lot of things, and it got to the point where, I mean, there's no amount of even a person like me couldn't help them, right? I'm the guy you call in usually when things are pretty bad. There was nothing I could do because at the end of the day, it was the leadership basically trumped every decision, and so there was not a willingness to hear anything except, I suppose, what the owner of this company wanted to, tell themselves, and so.
And in addition to that, like I hear data as a product a lot and like self-serve. And do you think in order for an organization to be data driven, that stakeholders and end users of the data need to be able to query it and really analyze it beyond just looking at a dashboard?
I mean, potentially, yeah. I would say that the data, I mean, the experience with data just should be very seamless, right? It shouldn't be a thought like, oh, I have to go to the data team to get something, right? It's like I have data and I can do stuff with it, and I know I can make good decisions with it. Back to the original point, is the data believable and do I get value out of it? If those two things are like not really thought about and it just organically happens, then that's the situation you want, right? Whereas miracles could happen that way. I mean, some of those highly productive data teams I've ever seen were using Excel and like querying like relational databases is way back in the day, but just because they knew what they needed to do, and data just happened to be something that the data they get from the database just happened to be something that they use to get their jobs done, right? I think over the years what I've seen is as data has become more popular, because back when I got into it, data was like not the cool thing at all. It was like basically the equivalent of like the guy in Office Space, the guy with the red stapler who they stuck in the basement. Like that was the data guy or gal. Like it was not cool. It was like the least sexy job you can get into, right? So what's happened, I think, is data has become sort of a force on its own, and what's been really missing is the application of just using data to do something with it, right? And so back in my day, I sound like an old geezer at this point, but it was like that's how it was. Like you get data and you do shit and you drive the business. That's how it is. And so so in that case it was like there was no like I guess it was self-serve, but it was just like, yeah, I mean, we have what we need to get our job done, and so that's kind of how it was. So, yeah, but I think we overthink things a lot too as an industry. So,
I
like,
for sure do.
self-serve, for example, it's like it's a good ideal for sure, and I think it's a good idea. The issue is even if I gave you all the data you wanted when you wanted it, would you do anything with it? Right? So the data has to be tied to some sort of an outcome and an output at the end of the day, and some sort of action. So. But Yeah, I'm sure I understand your question, Gabe. Are you sure you
He's
want?
being sarcastic.
Oh, okay.
Or
Sure.
is he? I don't know.
You were
Yeah.
commenting on how maybe we overthink things
Oh
sometimes.
yeah, yeah. No, I overthought your question. How it happens, but yeah, I mean, these are just some of the things. Again, this isn't exclusive to data engineering. I see this in data science. I see it in analytics. I see it just across the board, right? Software engineering is kind of the same way, but at least with that, like the feedback loop between building an application or a feature and the outcomes, I think pretty quick. Data is one of these things where the feedback loop could be slow or it could be fast or it could be never, right? So that's the weird thing with data is like what are you trying to do with it? So and that's where the notion of like time horizons just gets a lot more fuzzy because it's like that I don't know. And the
So
other thing is your data could be wrong for years and you wouldn't even know it. I actually worked at a company where that happened.
that brings to mind a question that comes up from a conversation I had even earlier today regarding trust in data, as you've been talking about, but also in kind of the timeliness of it and feedback cycles. And have you found that there are certain effective practices in terms of arriving at those fast feedback cycles while still maintaining a high level of trust? Because those things seem to be in tension.
Could you rephrase that just a bit? Sorry, but my wife had messaged me on it. So,
Sure,
about
sure.
something. Yeah.
So, thinking about trust and data being, a very important aspect of the data that we're all, in the process of curating, but also how do we ensure that we're getting, good quality feedback and timely feedback? And sometimes there's a tension between, getting something out there, in a very kind of agile minded way. How do we get
Mm.
something out there quickly and get feedback quickly so that we can converge on correctness in a shorter overall timeline rather than having data teams, quite often it seems like data teams just work really hard to get things perfect. But there's a lot of perhaps wasted cycles on that because without getting the feedback, it's not going to be.
Oh gosh, yeah, this happens all the time. I mean, how many people have the experience of working on something where it's like it's an emergency? Say like, oh, an exec needs a report or some sort of insight on the next 3 hours, and you work on it, and they don't even do anything with it. Has everyone experienced this before? Yeah,
Yep.
it sucks, right? Like you work your ass off, and then it's like thanks, I guess. Yeah, I mean this happens. This happens a lot. I don't know. I don't know what the answer is to this. Sadly, it's like you could definitely try and set some boundaries and expectations with people and say, look, I need to hear back from you by this time. Here's the thing, though. Data teams are usually on the receiving end of a lot of stuff, right? It's like they say, crap rolls downhill, and that's just sort of the reality of it. And so that's where it comes back to team dynamics and making sure the data team is as much as possible integrated with the business itself, or it's not seen as like this one-sided relationship, which unfortunately it is, and there's sometimes no way around it. It's like, all the pressure's on you to get stuff done. Yeah, just in case somebody says, yeah, that happens a lot, right? Yeah, everything's an emergency, and so again, I don't know how you solve this problem. And I have this with clients too. They'll ask for stuff, um, and I'll deliver it, and then I'll be like, cool, did you really need that, or were you just trying to keep me busy for a bit and trolling me? Like this is cruel. Stop it. But this happens a lot, and yeah, I don't know. I wish I could answer your question with a definitive answer, but I think it comes down to who. It depends on who's asking the question, right? If your CEO says they need something in the next 2 hours, like you're gonna get it for them. It doesn't matter. So yeah, the feedback loop though, I would say like just set expectations, set boundaries, and this comes down to just I would say have a regular cadence with your stakeholders, and you might want to institute some sort of a process too by which people can ask for reports and also getting the feedback on those or whatever deliverable reports is one aspect of it, but like getting back a deliverable, and so but because you need to let people know too, like your time is valuable, and it's basic like human management, but yeah, unfortunately, it's usually very lopsided. People take advantage of data teams. I think too much. Lindsay asked a question here. What was the hardest part about writing a book? Do you have any advice for folks looking to get into writing? It's actually funny right now. Just talking with Zach Wilson about this new data engineering book he's looking at writing. So, yeah, I would say the hardest part of writing a book is I'm actually writing another book right now, so I can speak from what I'm going through. It's the dividing line between obsessively researching a topic and actually writing. So the thing you got to realize in writing is like the book ain't gonna write itself. So you have to set a schedule and a discipline to write regularly, whether that's daily, whether that's on some sort of a schedule. But you have to treat it like a job. I would say that was a hard part. I would say also having a co-author was hard. Like I love working with Matt, and he's one of my best friends. We write in very different ways. I'm very regimented. Every day is, task A is done, task B, I think in terms of Kanban boards and tickets. And Matt very much he just writes different. He's a great writer and one of the deepest thinkers I know, but he just, he'll just do things in large chunks, and that's how that goes. And, but at the end of the day, no matter how you do it, I would say, you got to understand how you work. And if you have a co-author, how are you going to work with that co-author? If you have a publisher, how are you going to work with a publisher, right? Like there's a lot of dynamics at play, and holding yourself accountable to deadlines is super key, especially if you have a publisher. You're going to be accountable to that. You're contractually obligated to finish this book. That is a business deal you just did. It's not like you can just flake out and not do the book. I mean, you could, but you're going to have consequences of that. So I don't think you want to deal with that. I had one friend actually who he didn't really do any work on his book, and then it was a week out from him needing to his deadline, and then his publisher bought him a hotel for that week and said, "You're not leaving until this thing's done." So you could do it that way too, but I would say your book is just going to suffer, right? And so the thing is, I think you want to write early and often, and then come back to your ideas, because the hard part isn't necessarily writing; it's editing. The refinement of your ideas is really where you're going to make the nuggets come out, in your book. And so, but writing a book in general is just really hard. Like I said, I was running a company at the same time and was doing a remodel. Oh, could you mute yourself? Thanks.
Yeah,
I stepped up.
I'll mute that.
Okay, thank you. But the hard part really is, it's like so I was running a business, remodeling a house, and writing the book at the same time. I joke that like smoking 5 packs of cigarettes and like shooting meth would have been like healthier than doing all that. So, it's depends what kind of punishment you want to inflict on yourself. So, but that said, if anyone wants to write a book, I mean, feel free to reach out to me. I'm got no shortage of opinions on this. Oh, and the other thing too, by the way, if you write a book, you got to realize you're responsible for marketing it too. Your publisher isn't, if you work with a publisher. So that's a little known secret of writing a book.
Wait, they don't market it at all?
Not really.
Interesting.
No, I had to do all the marketing for it. So,
well, it's worked.
Yeah, thanks. I mean, I have a book club out of it, so yeah, thank you. I got time for a couple more questions. How painful is the process? So the question is from Pratham. How painful is the process involved with getting edits, responses back from the publisher? I would say the publisher is actually pretty quick on getting things back. The thing is, you want to have a team of reviewers, technical reviewers, who also work with you on your book. That is the more challenging thing, because your reviewers are typically doing this out of the kindness of their own hearts, not because they're, getting anything out of the experience. And so that, I would say, getting feedback from the people who are helping you review the book is actually more key. So we had to have basically a bench of reviewers. I think, it was an ongoing bench of people. Life happens, like people have kids, people get sick, especially during COVID, people were just out a lot, like laid out. So it's sort of reminded me of like a war or something like that, where it's like just people are in the medic, getting healed up. You got to bring in, some new, fresh troops to help out, and that's just kind of how it is. But you want people pushing back on your ideas. And so your publisher, though, I would say, they're pretty, at least O'Reilly's really good at getting back to you. I would say the development process of writing a book with O'Reilly was second to none. They're world class, absolutely world class. Like, they just know what they're doing. So that's a good question, though.
If you could rewrite one chapter of the book, which one would it be? That's just another way of saying, which chapter are you satisfied with, but not like totally satisfied with?
I would say chapters 3 and 8. And I would say because 3 is it's about architecture, and that's an ever-moving target. I mean, the simple litmus test I would give people is go find somebody with the word architect in their title and ask them what architecture means. It's an amusing exercise. You will come up with as many definitions of architecture as you will people that you spoke with. I think that chapter is sufficient to describe architecture to a data engineer. I also feel it could use some enhancement. Chapter 8, I feel like the data modeling section needed a bit more emphasis. I mean, that's the book I'm writing right now, is an entire book on data modeling. But I feel like that's also a that's a rabbit hole. That's more like a black hole, actually. Um, there's so much to data modeling and so many opinions. I would say that's a very fascinating topic to dive into. Like right now, I'm reading what was it? 50 Years of Relational and Other Database Writings. Very fascinating book for sure. But it goes into the history of at least the relational world and for example, like several criticisms of SQL. Everyone hates SQL if you're like a pure relational person. So that's funny to read about, and just and sort of realizing too that the world we live in today with databases was actually, I would say, partly an accident. It's sort of it's sort of how life came into being on the planet in a way. It's like a lot of it is just like kind of dumb luck, relational databases and SQL and whatnot. I mean, a lot of it was driven by a couple big companies at the end of the day, even though they were arguably an inferior option. And the fact that there might not be actually a true relational database on the market is another interesting facet of the discussion. But we are where we are, and things work, obviously, right? And so, a lot of companies have been successful in the infrastructure they build, and they don't follow a lot of purist ideas, and yet they're still working, obviously. And so, but that's the chapter I would also fix, is I think chapter 8. I think the modeling was kind of a fascinating topic on its own, but it'll be a fun one. Ray asks, what are you most excited about for the near future for data engineering? What direction are you hoping for more work toward? I think for the first part, I'm very excited about what's happening next. This is another blog post I'm writing. I feel like the modern data stack is great. I also think that it has kind of had its day in some regards. Like when you look back to what I consider the dawn of the modern data stack is Redshift, and that came out literally 10 years ago last week at reInvent, right? So what that did is it commoditized and made available to a public cloud a cloud data warehouse, right? And what used to cost you millions of dollars on a onerous contract with a big tech company would now cost you 25 cents an hour, and you just kind of pay as you go. And I thought that was pretty cool. And that more than anything, kind of to me represents what the modern data stack is. It was just bringing a lot of this expensive analytical power to the masses, right? In a cheap and easy to use way, in a very modular way. But I think it's just the start of things. If you kind of look out to what's happening soon, it's I'm excited for I think the next shoe to drop will be the commoditization of real time, and so I think that's a really big one. Stay tuned for that. I think streaming pipelines or streaming applications are going to be as easy to make as things like Snowflake are easy to power up now. That doesn't mean the modern data set goes away. It just means there's more capabilities surrounding it and maybe different ways of doing stuff. I would say the other thing I'm very fascinated by is small databases. I call it sort of the return to Microsoft Access, actually. And so what I'm referring to is DuckDB, which, strangely enough, one of the co-founders of MotherDuck, which is an analytical company focused on DuckDB, he was a founding engineer of a BigQuery, right? So I mean, he's seen a lot of data, I'm sure. But he also told me, like, when he looked at the usage of BigQuery, it was all small data sets for the most part. There weren't a lot of large data sets being used, and so they called it easy query because it's easy to query data. But I think when he was at a single store, this is Jordan Tigani, there was some work being done with WASM, WebAssembly language. So I think maybe the dawning realization is, well, why don't you just if you could put an analytical database in the web browser that you could just run locally, like why, that cuts back on the back and forth on a network, for example, of data. And now it allows you to start doing stuff that you probably were never able to do before, right? Except when you had, again, I said jokingly, Microsoft Access on your computer back in the day. And so I think data is going to be more localized too. If you think about that power, I mean, I'm running an M series Mac right now, and if I look at the amount of idle compute on that thing, it's most of it, right? I mean, these new machines are just so powerful. It's like, what do you need them for? I think that that taking advantage of that latent compute, spare compute, is going to open up a whole new realm of possibilities. So I think that's another thing that's, I think, is sort of the future of data engineering. Where what if you had basically a whole data system that operated within your browser, or it was sort of an extension of the cloud? I think that's pretty fascinating. And the other stuff I'm fascinated by, and I think it's the future, is obviously a lot of the work being done on machine learning. I think you're going to see the intersection of machine learning engineering and data engineering coming to the fold. Like, was it Chat GPT is obviously the one that's captured everyone's attention for the last couple of weeks, and I think that's just the tip of the iceberg, really. There's going to be a lot more exciting stuff. So but what all this means at the end of the day is it means that data engineers and analysts and data scientists can now focus on turning their attention to causal type questions. Like, why did something happen, or how did it happen? Not necessarily like when or what happened. The descriptive statistics, I think that'll largely be automated for a number of reasons, with real time, with machine learning and so forth. And so I'd say it's the technology that's interesting. It's also the application of what you can do with data and the insights you can get. To me, it's actually more fascinating, because I think for the first time you actually have a chance of getting out of this descriptive analytics hellhole that we're sort of in right now. So we have been in as an industry for decades. So cool. Well, I actually have to drop off. I have to go take off to a lunch now, but these are good questions. I'm glad to meet everybody. So
Thank you very much, Joe.
thank you. And if you like the book, please give it a 5-star rating on Amazon, and it goes a long way towards helping the book get out there for more people. But yeah, great to meet everybody. If you haven't connected with me on LinkedIn, please do so. And I also have a new Substack at joereis.substack.com that you can check out. So weekly articles there. But yeah, excited. This book club is it's a great thing you're doing there, Parker, and so much appreciated.